Negotiable. She had answered that advertisement not out of desperation, not entirely, but because at 26 years old in Philadelphia in 1882, capable and steady were the only two things anyone had ever called her worth keeping. She'd decided to go somewhere those qualities actually mattered. What nobody in Philadelphia had told her, what the letter had carefully not said, was that Red Hollow looked like a town that had already given up. She stood on the platform and felt the cold come right through her coat. November in Colorado was a different thing than November in Pennsylvania. It had teeth. It had intention. She pressed the letter into her coat pocket and picked up her suitcase and looked around for a man named Caleb Boone. He wasn't hard to find. He was the only one not staring at her. Every other man on that platform had turned to look. 3 women near the station door whispered behind gloved hands. A boy of about 10 stopped chewing whatever he was chewing and just watched her with his mouth open. Evelyn was used to being looked at. She was not a beautiful woman by the fashion standards of the city. Her nose was too strong, her eyes too direct, her posture too deliberate for anyone to call her soft. But she was striking in the way that competence is striking, and people in small towns always noticed when something new walked in. Caleb Boone stood apart from all of it, leaning against a post with his hat pulled down and his arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't watching her arrive. He was watching the street behind her, scanning for something she couldn't identify. When she walked toward him, he straightened up slowly, like a man carrying weight he'd forgotten was there, until he had to move. He was older than she'd imagined. Not old, perhaps 35, but weathered in the way that men who work hard land get weathered. His jaw was set. His eyes, when he finally looked at her directly, were a pale gray-green and deeply tired. "Miss Mercer," he said. Not a question. "Mr. Boone," she said. "I'd say it's a pleasure, but I suspect we should wait and see." Something moved across his face. Not a smile exactly. The memory of one maybe. "Fair enough," he said. He took her suitcase without asking, turned, and started walking. "We've got a 15-minute ride to the ranch. There are some things I need to tell you before we get there." "That sounds ominous," Evelyn said, falling into step beside him. "It is," he said. "I figured you deserved to hear it before you saw it." The wagon moved through town, and Evelyn watched Red Hollow go by and understood very quickly that things were worse than the letter had suggested, not because the town looked poor, though it did, but because of the way people looked at Caleb. She caught it in the periphery of her vision. A man outside the hardware store who glanced at Caleb and then looked away too fast. 2 women who stopped their conversation and watched the wagon pass with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite contempt, but lived somewhere between the two. A boy who started to wave and then seemed to think better of it. "You're not popular here," she said. "That's one word for it," Caleb said. "What's another word for it?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Finished," he said quietly. "Most of them think I'm finished." Evelyn absorbed that. "Are you?" He didn't answer immediately. The wagon wheels found a rut in the road, and both of them adjusted without speaking. "The ranch has debt on it," he said finally. "More than I knew, or more than I understood at the time I signed what I signed. I've been working to untangle it for 3 years. Every time I think I'm close, something shifts and the numbers come out worse." "What kind of debt?" "The kind that has a man's name on it." Evelyn looked at him. "Victor Grayson," she said. That got his attention. He turned to look at her, and for the first time his expression was something she could read clearly, surprise. "How do you know that name?" he said. "I asked around before I left Philadelphia," she said. "I wrote to 2 people who'd advertised for wives in Colorado before you did. One of them had already lost his land. The other one told me about an investor out of Denver who'd been circling the valley for 15 years. He called him something I probably shouldn't repeat." She paused. "But he used Grayson's name." Caleb stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the road. "You investigated me before you came," he said. "It wasn't quite an accusation." "I investigated the situation," she said. "You seemed decent enough." A pause. "And what did you decide about the situation?" "That it was worse than you'd admitted in your letter, and probably better than you feared." She folded her hands in her lap. "I've seen fraudulent accounting before. My father was an accountant. I grew up watching him work. I know what numbers that have been moved around look like versus numbers that are simply bad. What you have, from what I could piece together from the outside, is the first kind." Caleb said nothing. The ranch came into view in the distance, the house, the barn, two smaller outbuildings. It was a working ranch, Evelyn could see that. It was not a failing ranch, not physically. The structures were maintained. The fencing was in repair. Whatever Caleb Boone had been doing for 3 years, he had not let the land go. "There are men here who depend on me," he said. 6 ranch hands. Good men. They've stayed even when I couldn't pay them full wages 2 seasons running. He set his jaw. "I won't let the ranch fail, but I've been fighting something I don't fully understand, and I don't have much time left to figure it out." "How much time?" she said. "Grayson's man came by last week," Caleb said. "Said if I don't settle the balance on the note by the 1st of December, he moves to foreclose." Evelyn did the arithmetic automatically. "That's 17 days. "Yes," he said. "It is." "Then we'd better start with the ledgers," she said. He looked at her again. This time the expression was harder to name. It was something in the neighborhood of relief, but it had caution running all through it, like a man who'd been disappointed enough times that he'd stopped letting himself feel the relief until it turned out to be real. "You're not what I expected," he said. "You're not what I expected either," Evelyn said. "I expected worse." The ranch hands were gathered near the barn when the wagon pulled in. 6 men, as Caleb had said. They watched her the way men in that world watched women who arrived without context carefully, with their faces arranged into something neutral that didn't quite hide the assessment happening behind their eyes. The oldest one stepped forward. He was somewhere near 60, with a thick white mustache and the hands of a man who hadn't quit physical labor a single day of his life. He looked at Evelyn, and then at Caleb, and then at Evelyn again. "This her," he said. "Walt," Caleb said a single word of warning. "Just asking," Walt said. He extended his hand to Evelyn. "Walt Pruitt. I've been on this ranch since before Caleb's father built the east fence." "Evelyn Mercer," she said, and shook his hand firmly. Walt looked at her handshake. His assessment shifted by some small but visible degree. "Where you from?" he said. "Philadelphia." "Long way," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." Behind Walt, the other 5 men had spread out in a loose half-circle. None of them were hostile, but none of them were welcoming either. They were men in a precarious situation, watching a variable arrive, and they were calculating what that variable meant for them. A younger man, perhaps 22, with red hair and an expression that couldn't quite commit to being unfriendly, said, "The boss said you did numbers, accounting and such." "My father taught me," Evelyn said. "You think you can fix what Grayson's done?" he said. "Because we've had 2 men try. Both of them looked at those ledgers and said there wasn't enough to work with." "What were their names?" Evelyn said. The young man blinked. "What?" "The 2 men who looked at the ledgers," she said. "What were their names?" "What firm did they work for? Who hired them?" A beat of silence. Caleb said quietly, "One of them came recommended by Grayson's bank." Evelyn looked at him. "Then he wasn't trying to help you." The understanding moved through the group slowly, man by man. The way understanding moves through a group that has been confused for a long time and suddenly sees the shape of what confused them. Walt said, "Son of a—" "Walt," Caleb said. "Right," Walt said. But his white mustache was twitching. The house was clean and spare and functional, and Caleb showed her to a room that had clearly been prepared in advance, a freshly made bed, a small dresser, a window that faced east. He showed her this without ceremony and without sentiment, and she respected that. "The study is at the end of the hall," he said. "That's where everything is. All the ledgers, all the correspondence, all the documents Grayson's office has sent in the past 3 years. I haven't been able to make sense of it. Have you organized it at all? I tried, he said. Mostly I've kept it from getting worse. She nodded. I'll start tonight if that's all right. He paused in the doorway. You just got off a 3-day train. I'm aware, she said. But you have 17 days, and I'll sleep better once I know what we're dealing with. He studied her for a moment. Then he said, I'll bring you coffee. It was the first genuinely warm thing he'd said to her since the platform, and he seemed slightly startled by it himself. The study was a catastrophe that looked like chaos, but wasn't. Evelyn had seen genuinely disordered paperwork. This was not that. This was the specific kind of disorder that resulted from a man who understood physical systems, land animals, weather equipment, trying to force himself to understand a symbolic system of numbers and legal language that worked entirely differently. Caleb hadn't lost track of things. He had carefully piled things he didn't understand in the order they'd arrived in stacks that kept the years mostly separate. That was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, more organized than the records of fraud usually were, because Grayson's men had never imagined that anyone would actually sit down to read them. She lit the lamp and opened the first ledger. Caleb came back with coffee 20 minutes later and found her on the floor, with 4 ledgers open around her cross-referencing columns, her lips moving slightly as she calculated. He set the coffee beside her without speaking. Sit down, she said, without looking up. He sat down in the desk chair. This entry here, she said, pointing to a figure in the 1879 ledger. What does this represent? What was the transaction? That's the quarterly interest payment, he said. On the original note. And this one. She pointed to a different entry 3 pages later. Also interest, he said. That was when they added the penalty clause. There is no penalty clause in the original agreement, she said. Grayson's men said there was an amendment. I'm sure they did, Evelyn said. Where's the amendment? Caleb was quiet. Is it in this room? She said. I have everything in this room, he said. Everything they sent me. Evelyn looked up at him for the first time since he'd sat down. They told you there was an amendment that increased your interest rate by 3 points and added a penalty structure, and they never sent you the physical document. He said nothing. Because he understood now what he was hearing, and what he was hearing was something he had not let himself fully believe until this moment in this lamplit room from the mouth of a woman he had known for 4 hours. They invented it, he said. They invented it, she confirmed. And every interest payment you've made based on the inflated rate has been theft. Not interest, not legal debt. Theft. The word landed in the room with weight. Caleb's jaw worked. I've been paying that rate for 3 years. And so, Evelyn said, have the other ranchers in this valley. She turned another page. Because this is not your ledger only. This pattern, this exact pattern of a false amendment followed by inflated interest, followed by a threatened foreclosure. I've already seen it in 3 different ranch accounts in this stack. 3 names. Different men. Same scheme. Same handwriting on the amendment references. Same pressure timeline. She turned to look at him fully. Victor Grayson isn't a creditor, she said. He's running a system, and you're not his only target. You never were. Caleb stood up from the chair. He walked to the window. Outside, the night had gone fully dark, and the wind had picked up, and she could hear it moving against the glass. How many? He said. I need more time to count, she said. But from what I can see tonight, at least a dozen ranches. Maybe 15. Over 15 years. He turned back from the window, and his face had changed. The exhaustion was still there, but something behind it had solidified. Something that had been uncertain was now certain. What do we do? He said. We build the case, Evelyn said. Meticulously, every number, every discrepancy, every forged reference. We create a record so complete and so irrefutable that when we stand in front of a federal marshal, no lawyer Grayson has, and he will have the best lawyers in Denver, can pick it apart. We, he said. It was not quite a question. "We," she said. "Unless you'd prefer to do it yourself." He looked at her. This woman he had hired through an advertisement, this stranger who had come off a train with a worn suitcase and stepped directly into the worst crisis of his life and said, "We," without hesitation. "No," he said quietly. "I wouldn't prefer that." "Good," Evelyn said. She picked up her coffee. It was nearly cold. She drank it anyway and opened the next ledger. "Then let's keep going." They worked past midnight. Walt knocked on the study door at 11 and opened it an inch without waiting for an answer and said, "You two need to eat something." He slid a plate of bread and cold meat through the gap in the door without looking at either of them, in the manner of a man who had decided to help without wanting to make a production of it. "Thank you, Walt," Caleb said. "Don't thank me," Walt said. "I got an interest in this operation surviving." He paused. "She finding anything?" Walt, Caleb started. "Enough," Evelyn said simply. A pause. Then Walt said through the inch of open door, "Good." The door closed. By 1 in the morning, Evelyn had laid out 4 distinct threads of fraud, each documented across a different rancher's accounts, each following the same pattern. Original legitimate loan. Fabricated amendment, inflated interest, accelerating penalties, foreclosure threat. At the moment, the target was weakest. It was elegant in the way that evil can sometimes be elegant, organized, and patient, and deeply deliberately hidden inside the language of legitimate finance. He assumed no one would ever know enough to read it, Evelyn said. He was right, Caleb said. Until now. Evelyn set down her pencil and pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment. "I need to sleep," she said. 3 hours. Then I need to start again. Caleb nodded. He had been quiet for the last hour, not idle, but pulling documents at her request, holding pages open, making note of names and dates she called out. He was, she had discovered, a precise and disciplined man. He had no gift for accounting. But he had absolute command of his own land and his own records, and the combination of her analysis and his knowledge of every transaction, every handshake, every man who had ever shown up with paperwork from Grayson's office was proving to be something none of Grayson's people had calculated. "There's one more thing," Caleb said before she stood up. "What is it?" He crossed to the desk and opened the bottom drawer and removed a smaller ledger, older, leather-bound, the spine cracked with age. He held it out to her. "This was my father's," he said. He kept it before the original note was signed. Every payment Grayson's father received. Every term of the original agreement. In my father's handwriting. Evelyn took the ledger carefully. "Your father negotiated with Grayson's father," she said. "Same scheme," Caleb said. "Different generation. My father paid them for 11 years before he died. He thought the debt was legitimate. He never stopped believing it was legitimate." His voice carried something measured and controlled, the tone of a man who had taught himself to speak about grief without letting it into his face. He died thinking he had failed his own land. Evelyn held the ledger. "He didn't," she said. "No," Caleb said. "He didn't. But he never knew that." The lamp burned between them in the silence. Outside, the wind worked its way under the door and moved the papers at the edges of the stacks, and Evelyn pressed her hand flat on the pile to hold them. "He'll know," she said, "in the way that it will matter. When this is finished and the record is corrected, your father's name will be part of what corrected it." Caleb looked at her. He said nothing. But something in the pale gray-green of his tired eyes shifted like a change in light, and Evelyn understood that she had said the right thing. And she understood also that for a man like Caleb Boone, the right thing said at the right moment was worth more than comfort or reassurance or any number of softer things. She stood and took the small ledger with her. 3 hours, she said. 3 hours, he said. She walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. "Mr. Boone," she said. "Caleb," he said. "Caleb," she said. "You were not wrong to ask for help." She did not wait for him to answer. She went down the hall to her room with her father's ledger in her arms and the lamp still burning in the study behind her. and in the morning there would be more ledgers and more numbers, and 17 days that had already become 16. But the shape of what had happened to this valley, the shape of it was no longer hidden. She had it now. And Victor Grayson did not yet know that she did. She slept 3 hours and woke before the sun. Not because an alarm pulled her out. There were no alarms in Red Hollow, but because her mind had kept working while her body rested, turning numbers in the dark, the way a mill wheel turns water. And by the time gray light started showing under her door, she already knew what she needed to look for next. She dressed quickly, pinned her hair without a mirror, and was back in the study before anyone else in the house had stirred. The fire in the hall had burned down to coals. Her breath showed faint in the cold air. She lit the lamp, opened her father's ledger, Caleb's father's ledger, and started from the first entry. Ezra Boone had been a careful man. Every figure was recorded in the same steady hand, the same dark ink with dates and descriptions beside each number. Payments made. Terms acknowledged. Interest calculated. 14 years of transactions, all of it painstakingly documented by a man who had believed he was managing a legitimate debt and had never once suspected he was being robbed. Evelyn worked through it slowly, then faster, as the pattern became clear. By the time she heard boots on the floorboards in the hallway, heavy, deliberate Caleb's step, she had already filled 2 pages of her own notebook with figures. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, carrying a tin cup of coffee in each hand. He stopped when he saw her. "You didn't sleep 3 hours," he said. "I slept enough," she said without looking up. He set one cup beside her and took the other to the chair across the desk and sat down with his forearms on his knees. "What did you find?" "Your father's original note," she said. "The 1868 agreement. The interest rate Ezra Boone signed was 6% annually." She turned the notebook toward him so he could see her figures. "The rate Grayson's office has been applying to your debt for the last 9 years is 11.5. Caleb looked at the numbers. Something moved through his jaw. "That's almost double," he said. "Nearly. And the difference, the 5.5% they've been collecting above what the original contract allowed, represents, across 9 years of payments, approximately—" She tapped the figure at the bottom of her notebook page. $4,230. Caleb set down his coffee. He pressed both hands flat on his thighs like he needed to do something with them that wasn't breaking something. $4,000, he said slowly. "That they took from you above what you legally owed," Evelyn said. "In your account alone. And that number grows when I add the fabricated penalty charges." She paused. "Caleb, your father's debt, the original principal, was paid off completely in 1876. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd heard since arriving in Red Hollow. Caleb lifted his head. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, and absolutely still. "Say that again," he said. "Ezra Boone paid the original note in full before he died," Evelyn said. "If you apply the correct interest rate, 6% as contracted, the final payment was made in March of 1876. Everything Grayson has collected since then has been collected on a debt that no longer existed." Caleb stood up. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to her for a long moment, his shoulders tight, his hands at his sides. 6 years, he said. 6 years, she said. "Your father spent his last years believing he was failing. You've spent 3 years trying to solve a problem that was manufactured. The ranch was never genuinely at risk from debt. It was only at risk from fraud." He turned around. His voice was very controlled. "I need to go outside for a minute." "Go," she said. He went. Evelyn listened to the door at the end of the hall open and close, and then she turned back to the ledger and kept working because the numbers didn't stop needing her attention, just because the truth of them was devastating. Walt found her there 40 minutes later. He came in without knocking, which Evelyn was beginning to understand was his way, and he looked at the stacks of papers around her and then at her face and said, "How bad is it?" "Very bad," she said, and not in the way anyone thought. He lowered himself into the chair Caleb had vacated. Meaning the debt isn't legitimate," she said. It never was not after 1876. Grayson's been collecting money that wasn't owed to him and threatening foreclosure on a note he had no legal right to enforce. Walt's white mustache worked for a moment. All of us knew something was wrong, he said. We just didn't know how to say what it was. Caleb's father, that man, worked until he dropped, paid every bill he could reach, believed if he just worked hard enough. He stopped. It ate him up. I know, Evelyn said. You didn't know him, Walt said. It wasn't an accusation, just a correction. No, she said, but I know what his ledger says, and it says he was an honest man who kept every record he was ever given. He signed what he was handed and paid what he was billed and trusted the numbers were true. She paused. The numbers weren't true. That's not a failure. That's a crime committed against him. Walt looked at her for a long moment. Then he put both hands on his knees and pushed himself to his feet with the effort of a man whose joints had opinions about mornings. I'll go check on Caleb, he said. He needed air, she said. He needs more than air, Walt said, but air is a start. He was almost at the door when he stopped. You want more coffee? Very much, she said. He nodded once like it was a transaction he approved of and left. Caleb came back in 40 minutes. He was composed, not calm exactly, but settled into a harder kind of composure, the kind that comes not from feeling less, but from deciding what to do with what you feel. He sat back down. He looked at her notes. What do we still need? He said. That was all. No lengthy processing. No circling back through the grief of it. He asked what still needed doing. Evelyn recognized that quality immediately and valued it deeply because it was exactly what the next 16 days required. We need the other ranchers' records, she said. I can identify the pattern in your accounts, but to take this to a federal marshal, we need to demonstrate that this is a deliberate scheme across multiple victims, not an isolated dispute over contract terms. Grayson will argue it's the latter. We have to make that argument impossible. Who do you want? He said. The men whose names I pulled from your files last night, she said. Harlan Pruitt, Walt's brother. Cousin, Caleb said. Harlan lost his north pasture to Grayson's bank 2 years ago. Thought he just couldn't make the numbers work. He could make the numbers work, Evelyn said. The numbers were wrong. Who else? Jim Aldridge, Tom Cassidy, the Devereaux brothers, out on the Eastern Ridge. He paused. Martin Cole, he sold out early. Took less than the land was worth because Grayson made him believe he had no choice. Martin Cole may be the most important witness we have, Evelyn said, because if he sold under fraudulent pressure, the sale itself could be challenged. That's not just damages, that's land recovery. Caleb was quiet for a moment, thinking. These men, he said, they've been beaten down by this for years. Some of them have stopped trusting anyone who comes around talking about Grayson. 2 of them have families. They're not going to want to step into a fight they've already lost once. Then we don't ask them to fight, Evelyn said. We ask them to sit at a table and let me show them what their own records say. That's all. The records will do the arguing. Caleb looked at her steadily. You're very certain, he said. I'm certain of the mathematics, she said. People are harder, but the mathematics gives us somewhere to stand. All right, he said. I'll ride out today. Start with Harlan. He trusts Walt, and Walt's already... He stopped. Walt's already decided about you, hasn't he? It wasn't really a question. Evelyn allowed herself a small half smile. He brought me a second cup of coffee, she said. For Walt Pruitt, I believe that constitutes an endorsement. Aunt. Caleb rode out before 8. He took the young red-haired hand whose name turned out to be Danny Croft with him as far as the Pruitt property, then sent Danny back while he went on to the Aldridge spread. Evelyn spent the morning in the study and found the thing she had not been looking for and had not expected to find, which is always the worst kind of discovery. It was in a folder at the back of the 3rd stack, a folder different from the others. Newer, the paper inside it, crisper and less handled than the surrounding records. Someone had filed it behind older documents, whether deliberately or carelessly, she couldn't yet tell. Inside was a letter. Not from Grayson's office. From Grayson himself, dated October 3rd, 1882, 6 weeks ago. Addressed not to Caleb Boone, but to a man named Silas Crowder, Esquire, Denver. She read it once quickly, then she read it again very slowly. Her hand was completely steady. That was something she would notice later, that her hand did not shake while she read the letter, even though its contents warranted shaking. Evelyn Mercer had inherited her father's accountant's composure, the ability to receive terrible information without physically reacting to it, because reacting to information before you understood all of its implications was a form of imprecision she had trained herself against. The letter was instructions. Specific detailed instructions from Victor Grayson to his Denver attorney about the Red Hollow Valley properties. It outlined a timeline for completing foreclosure proceedings on 7 named ranches, including the Boone property. It discussed the expected market value of consolidated land parcels after acquisition. It mentioned correcting the titles on properties already in transition language that to anyone who had spent a morning reading Grayson's accounting methods meant falsifying ownership records. And then at the bottom of the second page, a sentence that made everything else reorganize around it, like iron filings around a magnet. The woman he is marrying, if she arrives at all, should not be given any access to the ledger room. Boone is a simple man, but she may not be simple. Alert Hargrove at the station to note her arrival and report to me directly. Evelyn set the letter down. Evelyn set. Someone at the Red Hollow station had been watching for her arrival, watching and reporting to Victor Grayson. She thought back to the platform, the man near the freight office who had been too still while everyone else moved. She'd registered him in the way she registered everything, as a detail filed and not yet processed. He had processed her. Grayson had known she was coming before Caleb's wagon had cleared the edge of town. She stood up from the floor where she'd been sitting and walked to the window and looked out at the yard. The barn, the fence line running toward the road. And she thought, he's been watching this ranch since before I got here. He already knows I'm going through the records. He knew I would, or he feared I might, which is why that letter existed at all, which meant they had even less time than they'd calculated. Because if Grayson knew she was here, and knew what she was likely doing, he wouldn't wait for the December deadline. He would move early. He would manufacture a reason to accelerate, and he would do it before she had everything she needed. She went to the door and called for Danny Croft. He appeared from the barn at a jog. "Ma'am, how fast can you ride to wherever Mr. Boone is?" she said. Danny's face sharpened. He was young, but he read tone well. "Fast enough. What do I tell him?" "Tell him to come back today," she said. "Tell him it's not December we need to worry about. Tell him—" She paused, making sure the words were exact. "Tell him Grayson already knows." Danny was on a horse inside 90 seconds. Caleb came back in 2 hours with Harlan Pruitt riding beside him. Harlan was a leaner, sharper version of Walt. Same lines in the face, same look of a man who'd worked his whole life and was now standing in the wreckage of his assumptions about what work was supposed to earn you. He was 53 years old, and he walked into the study and looked at the papers spread across the floor, and he said, "Lord God Almighty," which seemed like a reasonable response. "You found something," Caleb said. He was looking at Evelyn's face rather than the papers reading her the way he was learning to read her. Not her expression, which gave away very little, but her posture, her stillness, the particular quality of how she held herself when she had found something important. "Grayson knew I was coming," she said. "He had a man watching the station. He has someone feeding him information about what happens on this ranch." She picked up the letter and handed it to Caleb. "And his timeline is not December. He wrote this 6 weeks ago, and his attorney in Denver is already moving on the title transfers. The foreclosure process has started in their offices. The notice he sent you is the last stage, not the first." Caleb read the letter. His face did not change, but a vein at his temple became visible in a way it hadn't been before. Harlan said, "Can I see that?" Caleb handed it to him. Harlan read it. He got to the bottom of the second page, and his jaw set like concrete. "He put my name in here," he said. The Pruitt property. He's got a number beside it. Like the land is already... He's already assigned a price to it, Evelyn said. In his own mind and in his attorney's files, that land is already his. He just needs the legal machinery to catch up. The land that my father homesteaded, Harlan said. The words were very quiet and very precise. 30 years ago. Yes, Evelyn said. Harlan set the letter down on the desk with both hands carefully, like it was evidence, which it was. Then he looked at Evelyn. What do you need from me? He said. Your records, she said. Every document Grayson's office ever sent you. Every payment receipt. Any correspondence. She paused. And your neighbors. Jim Aldridge and Tom Cassidy and the Devereaux brothers. Can you reach them today? Tom Cassidy won't come, Harlan said. He's afraid. Grayson's men came to his place last spring and told him if he talked to anyone about his financial situation, they'd call the note immediately. His wife's got children to feed, and he's not going to risk it. Then we go to him, Evelyn said. We take the evidence to him, not the other way around. We don't ask him to fight. We ask him to look at his own records with someone who can read them correctly. She looked at Caleb. Nobody asks a man to be brave. We give him information and let him make a decision. Caleb said, Aldridge will come. The Devereaux will come if Aldridge does. They've followed his lead for 20 years. Then start there, she said. Tomorrow morning. Can we have 5 men in this room by 9 o'clock? I can have them here, Caleb said. Good. Evelyn picked up the letter again. Because I need to finish building what I'm going to show them, and I need tonight to do it. And Grayson's informant, Harlan said. The man at the station. He's going to report that people are coming and going from this ranch. The three of them looked at each other. Walt appeared in the doorway, as he had a way of doing silently, at the moments when his presence was most needed. He'd been listening. He didn't apologize for it. I know who it is, he said. Everyone looked at him. Hargrove, Walt said. Runs the freight office at the station. He's been on Grayson's payroll for 2 years minimum. We all figured he reported things to somebody, we just didn't know who. Can he be managed? Caleb said. He's not a bad man, Walt said. He's a man Grayson has a grip on. He owes Grayson money. He paused. Different kind of grip than he's got on all of you. But same method. Evelyn said, Don't touch him. Don't confront him. Don't warn him off. She was quiet for a moment, turning it over. Let him report that people are visiting the Boone Ranch. Let Grayson think we're moving slower than we are. The moment we spook Hargrove, Grayson knows we've found the letter. Walt nodded slowly. So we let the rat run. For now, Evelyn said. Yes. Harlan Pruitt looked at her with an expression that was 3 parts respect and 1 part something that might have been wonder. Ma'am, he said, where exactly did you come from? Philadelphia, she said. But I grew up in my father's accounting office. She turned back to the ledgers. Which turns out to be an adequate education for this particular situation. That night, while the rest of the ranch slept, Evelyn built the document. It was not dramatic work. It was meticulous, grinding, precise work, the work of rendering invisible crimes visible, of translating 15 years of deliberate obfuscation into a sequence of clear facts that any reasonable person could follow. She cross-referenced the Boone accounts against the records Harlan had brought, and the pattern emerged with the clarity of something that had always been there, waiting for someone who knew what to look for. By midnight, she had isolated 6 distinct fraudulent mechanisms in Grayson's scheme. The false amendments, the inflated interest, the fabricated penalty structures, the artificially accelerated foreclosure timelines designed to catch ranchers at their most financially vulnerable. A side practice of buying distressed notes from other lenders, notes that were themselves legitimate, and then applying Grayson's own fraudulent terms retroactively. And at the center of it all, a set of master accounts held at Grayson's Denver bank, where the excess collections, the stolen money, was being laundered through a series of real estate investments in 3 different states. This was not the work of a man who had stumbled into fraud. This was a constructed empire. 15 years of engineering. Patient, sophisticated, and until this week, completely hidden. She stared at the master account figures for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and began to write the summary that would take it apart. At one point, she heard a sound in the hall and looked up to find Caleb standing in the doorway. He hadn't knocked. He was holding a lamp and he was watching her work, and his expression was something she hadn't seen on him before. Not relief, not gratitude exactly, but something rawer than either. "You should sleep," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't move. "My father used to say the truth always leaves a track. You just have to know how to read the ground." Evelyn looked at him. He was right. He was a smart man who got fooled by a smarter crook, Caleb said. "I used to think that meant he wasn't as smart as I thought he was." A pause. "I don't think that anymore. He kept perfect records," Evelyn said. "That's what's going to save this ranch. His records, his discipline, his refusal to throw away a single document across 14 years of payments." She held Caleb's gaze. "That is not the behavior of a man who failed. That is the behavior of a man who, without knowing it, built the case against the person who robbed him." Caleb was silent. Then he said quietly, "Thank you." He meant more than the words. She understood that, and she let him mean it without deflecting. "Go sleep," she said. "I'll need you sharp tomorrow." He went. She turned back to the page. Outside Red Hollow was cold and dark and completely still, and somewhere in Denver, Victor Grayson was sleeping without the smallest suspicion that the woman he had tried to dismiss before she'd even arrived had spent 2 nights pulling his empire apart with nothing but a lamp, a pencil, and the unshakable conviction that numbers do not lie. He would find out soon. She was almost ready to show him. They came at 9 o'clock, as Caleb had promised. Jim Aldridge arrived first alone on a gray horse he'd ridden hard enough that the animal was still blowing when he tied it at the post. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with a permanently wind-burned face, and the careful movements of someone who had learned to conserve everything energy words trust. He shook Caleb's hand at the door and looked past him into the house, and said, "Harlan said it was important enough to miss a morning's work." That's all he'd say. "It is," Caleb said. "Come in." The Devereaux brothers, Claude and Emmett, came 20 minutes later, riding together the way they did everything side by side, and close enough that their stirrups nearly touched. They were in their mid-50s, built alike, spoke alike, and had the particular solidarity of men who had never needed to find their footing alone because they'd always had each other. Claude nodded at Caleb. Emmett looked at the house as if deciding whether he trusted it. Harlan was already inside. Walt had coffee going. Danny Croft was stationed at the barn with instructions to watch the road and whistle twice if anyone came who hadn't been invited. The 5 men settled around the table in the main room, and then Evelyn walked in from the study with her notebook and 3 ledgers under her arm, and the room shifted the way rooms shift when the person with the authority walks in, regardless of whether that person was expected to have it. Jim Aldridge looked at her. "You're the wife," he said, not unkindly. "I'm Evelyn Boone," she said. It was the first time she'd used the name. She hadn't planned it. It came out because it was accurate, and because in that room with those men being Caleb Boone's wife was the credential that mattered. "And I've spent the last 2 days reading Victor Grayson's accounting records. Yours are included." Aldridge's eyes narrowed. "How do you have my records?" "The copies Grayson's office sent you are the same copies they sent Caleb," she said. "They're in his files because Grayson's system is standardized. He uses the same language, the same clause structures, the same fraudulent amendment references across every account in this valley." She set the ledgers on the table. "The only thing that changes is the name at the top of the page." She opened the first ledger and turned it to face Aldridge. "This is your original note from 1874. The interest rate you agreed to was 7%. Can you confirm that?" Aldridge leaned forward and looked at the page. Something moved through his face. "That's my signature," he said. "Yes?" Evelyn said. "And this." She opened the second ledger, placed it beside the first. is the rate Grayson's office applied beginning in 1879, 11%. The amendment they claim justifies the change does not exist in any document they ever sent you. I've looked through everything in Caleb's files. It is not there. Aldridge stared at the two figures side by side. Claude Devereaux said, "That's the same number they gave us." Evelyn looked at him. 11%. Starting in 79, Claude said. They said there was a market adjustment clause. We asked to see the clause, and they sent a letter saying the clause was part of the master lending agreement held at their Denver office, and not in our individual paperwork. Which is legally meaningless, Evelyn said. A clause that affects your payments must be disclosed in your contract. A reference to a document you were never given and cannot inspect is not enforceable. She paused. They told you that because they knew you didn't have a lawyer to tell you otherwise. Emmett Devereaux said very quietly, "We lost the East Field." The room went still. The East Field, Emmett said again, as if saying it twice helped him believe it was real enough to be angry about. We gave it up in a settlement 2 years ago because Grayson's attorney said we were in default on the penalty structure. Said we owed back penalties on top of the inflated interest, and if we didn't settle, he'd take everything. He looked at Evelyn. We had no way to fight it. We thought the numbers were right. The numbers were not right, Evelyn said. She said it cleanly without softening it because softening it would have been a form of condescension, and these men deserved the plain truth. The penalty structure was fabricated. The settlement you signed under duress on the basis of fraudulent claims may be reversible. Emmett Devereaux put both hands flat on the table. Harlan said, "Can we actually get it back?" "That depends on a federal court," Evelyn said. "But the grounds exist. The question is whether we can build a case complete enough that a marshal will act and a judge will listen." She looked around the table. "That's why you're here. I need your records, and I need you to be willing to say in a formal proceeding what those records show." The silence that followed was not the silence of men who were afraid exactly. It was the silence of men who had been afraid for a long time and were now encountering something that asked them to stop being afraid and were trying to locate that capability inside themselves. Jim Aldridge spoke first. "What's the risk?" he said. "If we come forward, and it doesn't work, if Grayson's lawyers bury it, what happens to our land? If you do nothing..." Evelyn said, "You lose your land anyway. The foreclosure process is already moving in Grayson's Denver office. He is not waiting for December." She slid the Grayson letter across the table. "He wrote this 6 weeks ago. He assigned values to each of your properties. In his mind, this land is already his. The December notice is the public stage of a process that started months ago." Aldridge read the letter. He passed it to Claude. Claude passed it to Emmett. Emmett's hand tightened on it visibly before he passed it to Harlan. Harlan had already seen it. He looked at the others while they read it, watching their faces make the same journey his had made the day before. Aldridge set the letter down. "He put a price on my ranch," he said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "While I was still living on it, still working it." His voice had the particular flatness of a man who was containing something very large in a very small space. "He's been selling land he doesn't own yet." "He's been planning the acquisition," Evelyn said. "And yes, in his correspondence with his Denver attorney, he refers to these properties in the future tense of ownership, not as potential acquisitions, as properties in transition." Walt, who had been standing at the edge of the room without speaking, said, "There's a word for that." "Several words," Evelyn agreed. "The federal ones are what matter." She spent the next 3 hours going through every man's records, one at a time, with the others watching. She showed them what their original contracts actually said. She showed them where Grayson's office had deviated from the contracted terms. She showed them the false amendment references, the same phantom clause appearing in different forms across different accounts, always citing a master document that no one had ever seen because it didn't exist. The room's temperature changed as the morning went on. Not the physical temperature, but the quality of attention in it, the way 5 men who had arrived carrying the particular weight of long defeat slowly set that weight down as the mathematics exposed what had been done to them. Claude Devereaux, who had said almost nothing all morning, suddenly said, "The man who looked at my records 2 years ago. He told me the numbers were correct. He told me Grayson's interest calculation was standard." Evelyn looked at him. "Who sent him?" "He said he was from a firm in Denver," Claude said. "Henderson and Carr." Evelyn wrote the name down. "Henderson and Carr is on Grayson's payroll," she said. "They appear in his correspondence as his preferred audit firm for his word account verification. He sends them to look at the records of men who are starting to ask questions. They verify that everything is correct." She paused. "They are not there to verify the truth. They are there to end the questioning." The silence after that was different, harder, more specific. Emmett said, "So everyone we trusted to check the numbers was working for the man stealing from us?" "Yes," Evelyn said. Jim Aldridge stood up from the table, abruptly walked to the far wall, stood there with his back to the room for a moment. No one said anything. They gave him the space that a man needs when the full weight of something arrives all at once. Then he turned around. His face was completely steady. "Tell me what you need," he said. "From my records, from me personally. Tell me exactly what you need, and I will get it." One by one, the others said the same. It was Harlan who raised the question that had been sitting unspoken under everything else all morning. "Grayson's coming here," he said. "Isn't he? That's what you're not saying." Evelyn looked at him. "Yes," she said. "He'll come when he decides the passive approach has stopped working. When his man at the station reports enough unusual activity that he feels the need to apply direct pressure." "How long?" Caleb said. "Days," Evelyn said. "Perhaps less." She paused. "I want him to come here." Every man at the table looked at her. "I want him to come to this ranch," she said, "because when he does, he'll do what men like him always do. He'll come to intimidate. He'll make threats he believes we can't counter. He'll assume we're scared and disorganized." She looked around the table steadily. "And when he does, I will be ready to show him exactly how wrong he is." Walt said slowly, "You're setting a trap." "I'm preparing a presentation," Evelyn said. "There's a difference. A trap requires deception. This requires only that we be more prepared than he expects us to be." Caleb said, "And the federal marshal?" "We can't confront Grayson without legal backing. I'm writing to the federal marshal's office in Denver today," Evelyn said. "I need 2 things from this table before I do signed statements from each of you attesting to the fraudulent terms applied to your accounts and your original contract documents." She looked at them one by one. "I know what I'm asking. Your names on a statement against Victor Grayson is not a small thing." Aldridge said, "He's ruined enough. He's done." He said it with a finality that was not bravado, but something colder and more durable than bravado. "I'll sign." The others signed. The letter to Marshal Theodore Haynes of the Denver Federal Marshal's Office took Evelyn 2 hours to write and 4 drafts to get right. She was not a lawyer. She did not pretend to be one. What she wrote was a precise documented summary of a financial fraud scheme operating across a minimum of 12 properties in the Red Hollow Valley, supported by the accounting evidence she had compiled with specific reference to the Grayson to Crowder letter, as evidence of intentional coordinated criminal action. She cited statutes. She listed the names of all identified victims. She noted the names of Henderson and Carr as accessory parties. She noted the existence of Hargrove at the Red Hollow station as Grayson's informant and requested that Hargrove not be alerted to the investigation. She wrote it in the clearest language she knew how to use because the purpose of the letter was not to impress anyone with complexity. It was to make it impossible for a federal marshal to read it and find a reason not to act. Caleb read it when she finished. He read it twice. Then he looked up and said, "My God." "Is something wrong?" she said. "No," he said. "Nothing's wrong." He set the letter down carefully. "It's just, I've been trying for 3 years to find the words for what happened to this ranch, what happened to my father." He looked at the pages. "You found them in 4 days." "The words were always there," Evelyn said. "They were in the numbers. Numbers are just a kind of language." She took the letter back, folded it. "I'll need someone to ride to the telegraph office today. Not the station, there's a telegraph at Millard's store, isn't there? 2 miles east." "Danny can go," Caleb said. "Good. And I need him to go around the edge of town, not through it." Caleb nodded. He understood. If Hargrove saw a rider leave the ranch and head directly toward a telegraph office, Grayson's man would know before the message was halfway through transmission. Danny Croft, when given the telegram and the routing instructions, grinned the grin of a 22-year-old who had been quietly furious about the situation for months and was finally being given something useful to do with it. 2 miles east-south of the creek, avoid the main road, he repeated. "And if anyone stops you," Evelyn said. "I'm running a personal errand," Danny said. "Don't know anything about anything." "Exactly," she said. He was gone in 3 minutes. Grayson came on the 4th day. He did not come alone. He brought 2 men with him, large, quiet men who rode slightly behind him and said nothing and were there for the reason that men like that are always there. He also brought his attorney, a narrow-faced man named Bellows, who carried a leather case and wore a suit that had been pressed that morning, which in Red Hollow in November communicated its own form of contempt. Caleb saw them coming from the fence line where he'd been working alongside Walt. He didn't run. He finished the section of fence he was on, set the post driver down, and walked back to the house at a pace that communicated exactly nothing about how he felt. Walt watched the riders from a distance. 4 of them, he said quietly. "I see them," Caleb said. "You want me in the house." "I want you wherever Evelyn needs you," Caleb said. He went inside. Evelyn was already at the table. She had known the way she always seemed to know perhaps 15 minutes before they appeared. She had come out of the study with her documents organized into 3 separate folders and asked Caleb if the coffee was hot and whether Walt's cousin Harlan could make it back to the ranch within the hour. Caleb had sent a hand for Harlan at a run. Harlan had made it with 20 minutes to spare and was now sitting in the study with Jim Aldridge, who had arrived the previous morning and had not left when Evelyn suggested quietly that it might be worth staying. Victor Grayson knocked on the door. He knocked the way men knock who don't expect the door to open slowly. 3 short, hard raps, the knock of someone who is used to making entrances. Caleb opened it. Grayson was not what Evelyn had pictured, though she hadn't made the mistake of picturing him too specifically. He was in his mid-50s, heavier than his correspondence suggested, with a face that had once been handsome and was now the kind of face that expected to be given whatever it asked for. He wore a good coat. He held his hat in his left hand as a gesture of courtesy that his eyes did not support. "Boone," he said. "I understand you've had some activity up here. Figured it was time we had a conversation man to man." "Come in," Caleb said. Grayson stepped through the door and stopped. Evelyn was seated at the head of the table. 3 folders were stacked precisely in front of her. Her hands were folded on top of them. She looked at Victor Grayson the way her father had taught her to look at numbers that didn't add up, without hostility, without anxiety, with the simple and total patience of someone who already knew what they were going to find. Grayson looked at her, then at Caleb, then back at her. "I said man to man," he said. "My wife handles our financial affairs," Caleb said. He said it easily, without hesitation, and Evelyn registered it, the we of it, the our, the total absence of apology in his voice. Grayson's attorney Bellows moved to speak. Grayson stopped him with one hand and walked to the table and pulled out a chair and sat down. Because whatever else he was not stupid, and he understood that leaving was not an option that served him. "All right," he said. "What is it you think you've found, Mrs. Boone?" "I don't think I've found anything," Evelyn said. "I've found it." She opened the first folder. The original note signed by Ezra Boone in 1868 specifies an annual interest rate of 6%. The rate your office has applied since 1879 is 11.5%. The amendment your office claims authorizes this change does not exist in any document ever furnished to this property. She slid the first document across the table toward him. "This is the original note. I'd like you to show me the amendment." Grayson didn't touch the document. That paperwork is kept at our Denver office. Your Denver attorney is Silas Crowder, Evelyn said. I've written to his office requesting the amendment document under the terms of the original lending agreement, which requires that any modifying clause be available to the borrower upon request. A pause. I've also written to the federal marshal's office in Denver. Marshal Haynes is aware of this matter. Something happened in Grayson's face. It was small and fast, and he controlled it within a second. But Evelyn had been watching for it, and she saw it. You've involved a federal marshal, he said, over a contract dispute, over a fraud scheme that spans 15 years and a minimum of 12 properties in this valley, Evelyn said. She opened the second folder. These are the account summaries for the Boone property, the Pruitt property, the Aldridge property, and the Devereaux brothers operation. In each case, the same pattern of fabricated amendment, an inflated interest rate, a penalty structure with no contractual basis, and a foreclosure timeline engineered to hit at the point of maximum financial vulnerability. She slid the summaries across one by one. The handwriting on the amendment references in each account is identical, which means the same person fabricated all of them. Bellows, the attorney, said, Mrs. Boone, these are serious allegations. Yes, she said. They are. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Grayson. I also have your letter to Mr. Crowder dated October 3rd of this year, in which you outline the acquisition timeline for 7 Red Hollow properties and instruct Mr. Crowder to begin title transfer proceedings. She laid the letter on the table between them. You wrote this letter while simultaneously assuring these men that they had until December to address their accounts. You were running 2 processes in parallel, a false negotiation and an active acquisition. That is not a contract dispute, Mr. Grayson. That is wire fraud, mail fraud, and theft by deception across multiple counts. The room was completely silent. Grayson looked at the letter. His face was very still, and Evelyn understood the quality of that stillness. It was the stillness of a man performing a calculation, not an emotional response, a strategic assessment. He was measuring what she had, measuring what he had, and looking for the gap between them. You've been busy, he said. His voice was controlled. I've been precise, she said. You know, he said, and he leaned back in the chair slightly, and something shifted in his posture, a move toward a different kind of pressure, slower, quieter, designed to locate a weakness. A woman who comes to a place like Red Hollow answering a newspaper advertisement and then starts making accusations against a man with considerable legal resources and considerable standing in this territory. He paused. That woman might find this becomes very complicated for her. Caleb said, Mr. Grayson? Grayson looked at him. You just threatened my wife, Caleb said. In my house. His voice was quiet and absolutely flat. I'd like you to think carefully about whether that's the position you want to be in, given that what she just laid on that table is a summary of what's going to a federal marshal, regardless of anything you do in the next 5 minutes. Grayson looked at Caleb. He looked back at Evelyn. He picked up the Crowder letter and read it, or appeared to read it. She suspected he was buying time. The study door opened, and Harlan Pruitt walked out, followed by Jim Aldridge. They positioned themselves at the edge of the room, not speaking, not needing to. Their presence said everything they needed to say. Grayson set the letter down. What is it you want? He said. The shift in his tone was subtle, but absolute. He was no longer performing authority. He was negotiating. I want a federal investigation, Evelyn said. I want every account in this valley audited against the original contracted terms, and I want every dollar collected above those terms returned to the men it was taken from with interest. She folded her hands again. I want the Devereaux East Field restored to its owners, and I want Martin Cole's sale revisited because it was made under fraudulent duress. Grayson's jaw tightened. You're asking me to dismantle? I'm telling you what the federal marshal is going to ask, Evelyn said. I'm giving you the opportunity to cooperate before he asks it. That cooperation will matter. The absence of it will matter differently. She looked at him without blinking. You built something over 15 years by assuming no one would ever sit down and read the numbers. I've read them. So has the marshal's office as of 2 days ago." She paused. "The question now is only how this ends, not whether." The room held its breath. Victor Grayson looked at Evelyn Mercer. This woman who had arrived on a train 4 days ago, with a worn suitcase, and no standing in this valley, and no legal authority of any kind. And he looked at the 3 folders on the table in front of her, and at the 2 men standing at the door of the study, and at the rancher beside him, whose posture had not changed from the moment he'd opened the door. And he understood with the particular clarity of a man whose entire operation rests on the assumption that other people are weaker than him, that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had dismissed her before she arrived. He had assumed she would be simple. He had even written that assumption into a letter. He looked at that letter now sitting on the table between them in her handwriting on his paper. "I'll need to consult with my attorney," he said. "Of course," Evelyn said. "I'd suggest doing so quickly." Grayson stood. He retrieved his hat. He looked at Caleb, and then at Evelyn, and in his look was something that was not quite respect and not quite fear, but occupied the narrow, cold territory between the two. He left without another word. Bellows followed, nearly stepping on the back of his boots. The 2 large, quiet men went last. The door closed. Nobody in the room moved for 5 full seconds. Then Walt, from somewhere behind Caleb, said, "Well, that was something." Harlan sat down heavily in a chair and put his hands over his face. Jim Aldridge walked to the window and watched the 4 horses move down the road without speaking. Caleb looked at Evelyn. She was still seated at the head of the table, both hands still folded on top of the remaining folder. Her expression was steady, not triumphant, not relieved. Focused. The way she had looked every time he'd seen her in the study over the past 4 days, entirely present, entirely committed to the work not yet finished. "He'll come back with more lawyers," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "And we'll be ready for that too," she said. She picked up the 3rd folder and opened it. She was already working on the next step. The reply from Marshal Theodore Haynes arrived on the 6th day. Danny Croft brought it from Millard's store at a hard gallop, came through the yard, already swinging off the horse before it had fully stopped, and pushed through the front door with the envelope held out in front of him, like a man delivering something that might be explosive in either direction. Evelyn took it. She did not open it immediately. She turned it over, once read the return stamp, set it on the table. "Well," Danny said. "Give me a moment," she said. "A moment," Danny repeated, as if the word personally offended him. Walt put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Let her be." Evelyn opened the envelope. She read the letter once through completely before she said anything. Caleb watched her face and learned nothing from it, because her face during the reading of important documents was the most controlled thing he had ever observed. A kind of professional stillness that he'd come to understand was not coldness, but discipline, the habit of a mind that refused to react before it had finished processing. Then she set the letter flat on the table and said, "Marshal Haynes is sending 2 deputies to Red Hollow. They'll arrive within the week. He's asking us to hold all original documents and make no further direct contact with Grayson or his representatives until the deputies have reviewed the evidence." Danny Croft made a sound that was approximately a cheer. Walt said, "A week." 5 to 7 days, Evelyn said. Caleb said, "Grayson won't wait that long." "No," Evelyn agreed. "He won't." She said it without alarm. She had been thinking about this since the morning after Grayson's visit, when she had gone back through the letter to Crowder with fresh eyes and noticed the phrase she'd initially flagged but not fully weighted, "expedite the title filings if resistance is encountered." Resistance had now been encountered. Grayson would know that by now because Bellows would have told him, and Grayson's instinct when cornered was not to retreat. His entire 15-year history made that clear. His instinct was to accelerate. "He's going to try to file before the marshal's deputies arrive," Evelyn said. "Move the foreclosure through the local county clerk and get a filing on record before there's federal oversight in place." She looked at Caleb. "Who is the county clerk?" "Roy Fenner," Caleb said. Then his jaw tightened slightly. Roy Fenner and Victor Grayson have been on speaking terms for 10 years. Of course they had. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then, does Roy Fenner have his own debt? Caleb and Walt looked at each other. Almost certainly, Walt said slowly. He borrowed money to build that office of his back in '77. I never knew who held the note. I'd wager you do now, Evelyn said. The room absorbed that. Harlan said, so the county clerk is also under Grayson's thumb. It would explain why no filing complaint against Grayson has ever been recorded in this county, Evelyn said. Any document that came through Fenner's office would be seen by Grayson within the day. She paused. And any foreclosure filing Grayson wanted pushed through could be expedited without question. She looked at Caleb. We can't let Fenner process anything before Haynes's deputies arrive. If Grayson gets a recorded title transfer in place, even a fraudulent one, it creates a legal complication that takes months to unwind. That's what he's counting on. Caleb said, how do we stop it? We go to Fenner first, Evelyn said. Today. Roy Fenner was a small, damp-handed man who looked at Evelyn and Caleb across the counter of his office with the expression of someone who had just bitten into something sour and was trying to decide whether to swallow or spit. Evelyn didn't give him time to do either. She put the letter from Marshal Haynes's office on the counter between them. Then she put the Grayson to Crowder letter beside it. Then she put the one-page summary she'd prepared that morning, a clean, clear accounting of the fraud scheme, the named victims the evidence held, and the impending federal investigation. And she smoothed it flat with her palm and waited. Fenner read without touching any of it. I'm not sure what this has to do with my office, he said when he'd finished. Your office is the point of vulnerability, Evelyn said. If Victor Grayson files a foreclosure proceeding or title transfer on any property in this valley in the next 7 days, and that filing is processed and recorded before federal deputies arrive to review the matter, it will constitute an obstruction of a federal investigation. She met his eyes. That is a federal crime, Mr. Fenner, not a county matter. A federal crime, committed by the person who processes the filing. Fenner's damp hands moved to the edge of the counter. I process filings as they're submitted, he said carefully. I don't have the authority to refuse. You have the authority to hold a filing under administrative review, Evelyn said, for up to 10 days if there is reason to believe the underlying documents require verification. She slid a single sheet of paper across to him. She had written this out that morning as well, because she had known this conversation was coming, and she prepared for every conversation before she walked into it. This is the relevant County Administrative Code, Section 7, Paragraph 3. I'd like you to read it. Fenner read it. His face did not change, but something behind it changed considerably. Mr. Fenner, Evelyn said, and her voice dropped half a register. Not threatening but private, the voice of someone saying something that was meant only for the person in front of them. I know Grayson holds your note. I know that puts you in a position you did not choose and cannot easily exit. She paused. But I also know that the man who processes a fraudulent foreclosure filing during an active federal investigation does not get to claim he was just doing his job. The deputies who arrive will ask questions. The answers will matter. She looked at him steadily. Protecting Victor Grayson at this point protects a man who is already finished. The only question is how many people he takes down with him. The silence in the small office was absolute. Caleb stood slightly behind Evelyn and to her left, and he said nothing because there was nothing to say. Evelyn had said it all, and said it with a precision that left no useful response available. Fenner looked at the marshal's letter one more time. Any filing submitted in the next 10 days, he said slowly, will be held under administrative review pending verification of underlying documents. Thank you, Evelyn said. She picked up the Grayson letter and the marshal's letter and put them back in her case. She left the summary on the counter. Keep that copy. They walked out. On the street, Caleb said quietly, He'll tell Grayson. Immediately, Evelyn agreed. Which is fine. I want Grayson to know the county clerk can't be used. I want him to understand that every route he thought he had is closing." Grayson's response came not in person, but through Bellows, the attorney who arrived at the ranch on the morning of the third day after the county clerk visit with a document case and a practiced expression of professional courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. Evelyn met him at the door before Caleb could. "Mr. Bellows," she said, "does Mr. Grayson want to negotiate?" Bellows paused. "He's prepared to discuss a settlement of the outstanding account matters," he said carefully. "Which outstanding account matters?" she said. "His or ours? A beat. My client is prepared to consider an adjustment to the interest terms applied to the Boone account, and—" "No," Evelyn said. Bellows stopped. "We're not negotiating the Boone account in isolation," she said. "We're not negotiating anything in isolation. The federal investigation covers 12 properties. Any settlement discussion happens through Marshal Haynes's office in the presence of all affected parties with full disclosure of all accounts." She looked at him with the calm patience that was beginning to make people slightly uncomfortable in the way that an immovable object makes a moving one uncomfortable. "If Mr. Grayson would like to initiate that process, he's welcome to contact the Marshal's office directly." Bellows looked at her. He was a man who was good at his job, and his job was reading rooms and finding angles, and he was finding for the second time in a week that this particular room had no useful angles. "Mrs. Boone," he said, "my client has considerable legal resources and considerable standing." "You said that before," Caleb said from behind Evelyn. "Or words to that effect. We're aware of his resources. We've built the case accordingly." Bellows left. Walt watched him go from the barn. "He looked unhappy," he told Harlan afterward. "Good," Harlan said. The twist came on the fifth day, and it came from the last direction any of them had expected. Tom Cassidy knocked on the door at 7 in the morning. He was alone, which was unusual because Tom Cassidy had not gone anywhere alone since Grayson's men had shown up at his property the previous spring. He was a lean, weathered man in his early 40s, with the permanent look of someone carrying more than his frame was built for, and when Evelyn opened the door, he pulled his hat off and held it in both hands and said, "I need to show you something." He came inside. He sat at the table, and he opened his coat, and he removed a folded envelope that had been tucked against his chest close to his body, the way a man carries something he's afraid of losing or having taken from him. He unfolded it on the table. It was a letter. Not from Grayson's office. From the bank in Denver that held Grayson's primary accounts, a letter addressed not to Tom Cassidy, but to a man named Edgar Pratt, which was the name of a bank examiner who had apparently been conducting an independent review of Grayson's lending operations 6 years ago. The letter was a reply to Pratt's inquiry, and it said in the careful, hedged language of a bank that knew exactly what it was doing, and was trying to document that it had raised concerns that several irregularities in Grayson's account structures had been flagged for internal review. The letter was dated 1876. Grayson's own bank had flagged his practices 6 years ago. The review had apparently gone nowhere. Pratt had apparently gone nowhere. But the letter existed. "Where did you get this?" Evelyn said. "Grayson's man," Tom said. "The one who came to my place last spring. He left his case in the house when he went out to look at the fences. I didn't go through it. I swear I didn't look for anything. But this was sitting on top when I picked the case up to move it and it fell out." He looked at it on the table. "I've been keeping it under my floorboards for 6 months. My wife doesn't even know I have it." He paused. "I was afraid," he said. The words cost him something. "I've got 4 children. Grayson had a grip on my operation that I couldn't see around. Every time I thought about speaking up, I thought about what happened to Harlan's cousin when he asked questions, lost half his property in 60 days. He pressed his lips together. "I'm not asking you to think well of me for waiting. I don't think poorly of you for it," Evelyn said immediately. "You protected your family with what you had." She picked up the letter and read it carefully. Her pulse under her composed exterior had shifted significantly. "Tom, this letter proves Grayson's bank knew about the irregularities years before the current investigation. That means the bank has potential liability for continuing to facilitate his operations." She looked up. This is not just evidence against Grayson. This implicates an institution. Federal marshals become very attentive when a bank is involved. Tom Cassidy looked at her with the expression of a man who has been carrying a stone for 6 months and just handed it to someone else. "So, it's useful," he said. "It's more than useful," Evelyn said. "It may be the most important document in this entire case." Caleb looked at Cassidy. "Why did you come now?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "Because my wife found out I had it," he said. "She found it last night when she was checking for a draft under the floorboard." He paused. "She told me if I didn't bring it here this morning, she'd bring it herself." Nobody at the table said anything. Walt made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but occupied the same space. "What's her name?" Evelyn asked. "Clara," Tom said. "Clara Cassidy has more courage than most men I've encountered," Evelyn said. "Tell her I said so." Tom Cassidy's rigid posture shifted by some fraction of a degree. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and stood. "Whatever you need from me," he said. "Signed statement, testimony, whatever a federal court requires." He looked at Caleb. "I should have come sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." "You're here now," Caleb said. "That's what counts." Marshal Haynes's deputies arrived on the 7th day. 2 men. Deputy Carroll, who was methodical and spoke little, and Deputy Marsh, who was younger and sharper-eyed and asked very good questions, rode into the yard in the early afternoon and presented their credentials and spent the next 6 hours at the table in the Boone house, reviewing every document Evelyn had assembled. They worked through it without interruption, asking Evelyn to clarify specific entries, asking Caleb about transaction histories, asking Harlan and Jim Aldridge, who had both come at Evelyn's request to confirm their account summaries against the records on file. At one point, Deputy Carroll set down a ledger page and looked at Evelyn over it and said simply, "How long did this take you to compile?" "7 days," she said. He looked at the organized stacks, the original documents, the summary analyses, the cross-referenced account comparisons, the fraudulent amendment identification, the Crowder letter, the bank letter Tom Cassidy had surrendered, and he said nothing more for a moment. Then, "We'll need to take originals into federal custody." "I made copies," Evelyn said, and produced a complete duplicate set in a separate folder page for page, which she had spent the previous 2 nights creating. Deputy Carroll looked at the duplicate set. He looked at her. "You anticipated we'd need the originals." "I anticipated everything I could think of," she said. Deputy Marsh, who had said very little during the session, looked up from the bank letter, the Cassidy letter, and said, "This is going to reach beyond Grayson." "Yes," Evelyn said. "You understand that makes this considerably larger than a local fraud case." "I understand that's why it needs to be considerably larger than a local fraud case," she said. "Because if only Grayson is held accountable, the institution that enabled him for 6 years faces nothing. And in 5 years, there's another Grayson." She paused. "The bank letter matters because it demonstrates a systemic willingness to look the other way. That's what needs to stop." Marsh looked at her for a moment. "You should have been a lawyer," he said. "I'm an accountant's daughter," she said. "We see the same problems. We just use different tools." The freeze order on Grayson's accounts came 3 days after the deputies returned to Denver with the evidence. It came without warning, a federal order delivered simultaneously to Grayson's Denver bank, his attorney's office, and the county clerk's office in Red Hollow, halting all transactions related to Red Hollow Valley properties pending investigation. Word reached the Boone Ranch through Harlan, who had it from the telegraph operator at Millard's store, who had received the notification copy addressed to Fenner's office, and understanding its significance, had ridden to Harlan's property personally rather than waiting for the mail. Caleb was mending fence on the south pasture when Harlan found him. He heard Harlan's horse coming fast and set down his tools and waited. Harlan pulled up and said, "It's done." They froze him. Caleb stood with one hand on the fence post. "All of it," he said. "Everything connected to this valley," Harlan said. "His accounts, his pending filings. The title transfers he'd already started in his attorney's office. Harlan's voice had a quality it hadn't carried in years, a loosening, as if something that had been wound tight for a very long time had been given permission to release. Roy Fenner called Grayson's Denver office to confirm this morning. Grayson's people wouldn't take the call. Caleb looked out at the south pasture. The land he'd worked for 3 years under the weight of something he now knew had never been real. The land his father had worked under the same weight for 11 years before him. "Tell Evelyn," he said. "I thought you'd want to hear it first," Harlan said. "Tell Evelyn," Caleb said again, not dismissively, with something in his voice that said the telling belonged to her first because the doing had belonged to her, in a way that nothing in Caleb Boone's experience had prepared him to fully understand, and he was still learning the shape of his own gratitude. Harlan rode for the house. Caleb stood at the fence line a little longer. He pressed his hand flat on the top rail, felt the wood that he and his father had both touched, and he breathed in the cold November air, and he let himself feel very briefly and very privately what it meant to have the land back. Then he picked up his tools and finished the fence. Evelyn received the news standing in the study, as she had received most of the news of the past 10 days, surrounded by papers, in the middle of something. Harlan told her, and she listened without moving, and when he finished, she said, "Good. That protects the other filings Grayson had pending. Do you know which accounts were covered by the order?" "All of them," Harlan said. "Every Valley property." "Then Martin Cole's situation is protected too," she said. "The sale can be formally challenged without Grayson being able to move assets while the case is active." She set down her pencil. "Harlan, your north pasture is included in that freeze." He understood what she meant. The land his cousin had lost. The land that had been taken in a settlement built on fraudulent grounds. He sat down in the desk chair and he put his face in his hands, and he didn't say anything for a moment, and Evelyn let him not say anything, because she understood that some moments required silence, and this was one of them. When he looked up, his eyes were red, but his voice was steady. "How did you know?" he said. "When you arrived here? How did you know it was fraud and not just bad luck? Bad timing?" Evelyn thought about how to answer that. "I didn't know," she said. "I suspected because I'd heard the name Grayson before I arrived, and because the pattern that people described from the outside looked less like financial failure and more like financial engineering. But I didn't know until I read the first ledger." She paused. "The numbers told me. They always do. Numbers aren't loyal to the person who invented them. They just tell the truth eventually to whoever reads them carefully enough." Harlan nodded slowly. "Your father taught you that?" "My father taught me that," she said. She picked her pencil back up. "There's still work to do," she said. "The restitution calculations need to be complete before the marshal's hearing. Every dollar that was overpaid needs to be documented with the corresponding correct calculation beside it. That's how the affected families get their money back, not through someone's goodwill, but through a number on a page that a federal judge can order enforced." She looked at Harlan. "Can you get me Jim Aldridge's original payment receipts? He mentioned he kept them in a tin box in his barn." Harlan stood up. He was already moving toward the door. "I'll get them today," he said. Grayson came one more time. Not with Bellows. Not with the 2 large, quiet men. He came alone on a cold morning 9 days after the freeze order, and he knocked on the door without the authority of his previous knock, 3 raps still but slower with space between them. Caleb opened the door. Grayson looked older than he had 2 weeks ago. Not physically, it wasn't the kind of aging that happened to a man's face in 2 weeks. It was the aging that happens to a man's authority when the structure holding it up begins to come apart. "I'd like to speak with your wife," he said. Caleb stepped back and let him in. Evelyn was at the table as always. She looked at Grayson without speaking and waited. He sat down across from her without being invited to, and he put both hands on the table and he said, "My attorney tells me full cooperation with the federal investigation is my best remaining option." "Your attorney is correct," Evelyn said. He also tells me that the bank letter—" He paused, and something moved through his expression that was close to disbelief. "The Pratt letter. The letter your bank wrote in 1876, confirming that internal irregularities had been flagged in your account structures," Evelyn said. "Yes." "Where did you get that?" he said. And for the first time since she'd met him, Victor Grayson's voice had a quality in it that was not control or strategy or performance. It was genuine bewilderment. "From someone you underestimated," she said. "As it happens, that's a recurring problem for you." He was quiet. "If I cooperate fully," he said, "what happens to the bank?" Evelyn looked at him for a moment. "That's not a question I can answer," she said. "That's between the bank and the federal investigators." She paused. "But I'll tell you this. The letter demonstrates that the bank had knowledge and chose continued profit over corrective action. That decision belongs to the bank, not to the men in this valley whose money the bank continued to accept." Grayson sat with that. "You're not going to make this easier for me," he said. "No," Evelyn said. "I'm not. Because the men in this valley didn't get easier. They got harder every year of those 15 years. It got harder, and they kept going because they believed in their land and their work and the legitimacy of their contracts." Her voice stayed even. "You made a calculation that those men were too unsophisticated to protect themselves. I'd like you to sit with the fact that the person who undid that calculation was a woman you tried to dismiss before she stepped off the train." The silence in the room was complete. Victor Grayson looked at Evelyn Mercer, Evelyn Boone, and he said nothing. Then he stood up, and he put on his hat, and he walked out of the Boone house for the last time. Walt, watching from the barn, did not whistle or comment. He just watched the man ride away slowly in the direction of a future that had contracted considerably from what it had been 3 weeks ago. Inside the house, Caleb sat down across from Evelyn, and she pushed the restitution summary she was working on slightly to one side, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was both too much and nothing to say. Then Caleb said, 14 days. 13.5, she said. From the train platform, he said. 13.5 days. She looked at the papers around them. We're not finished, she said. No, he said, but we're going to finish it. He said it with a certainty that had nothing to do with optimism and everything to do with evidence. Together. Evelyn picked up her pencil. Together, she agreed, and she went back to work. The federal hearing was set for December 9th in the courthouse at Durango, 23 days after Evelyn Mercer had stepped off a train in Red Hollow with a worn suitcase and 6 words that started everything. She sat at a long table inside a federal courtroom and watched Victor Grayson's attorney try to argue that the evidence was circumstantial. Bellows had prepared. She'd expected that. He had 3 other attorneys flanking him, men from Denver with good suits and expensive educations, and they came in with the particular confidence of people who had won by overwhelming opponents before and expected to do it again. They filed motions. They questioned the chain of custody on several documents. They argued that the interest rate discrepancies were the result of a legitimate market adjustment clause that had been verbally communicated to borrowers. Verbally communicated, not written down, not documented. Verbally communicated, which was another way of saying it had never happened. Deputy Marsh, sitting beside Evelyn, leaned close and said quietly, "They're going to push the verbal agreement angle hard." "Let them," Evelyn said. She opened the second folder, the one she had not shown Grayson during his visit to the ranch, the one she had finished compiling at 2 a.m. 2 nights ago. Inside it was a single document she had constructed from cross-referencing the fabricated amendment references across all 12 accounts, with the dates on which each rancher reported first hearing about the interest rate change. She had then compared those dates with the dates of Grayson's internal correspondence with Crowder. In every case, every single case, the letter to Crowder discussing the rate change was written before the rancher was notified. In 3 cases, the Crowder letter predated the rancher's notification by more than 6 weeks, which meant the decision to charge the higher rate had been made in Denver in writing before any conversation with any rancher had occurred. The alleged verbal agreements were not conversations. They were announcements of decisions already made in secret. When Evelyn's turn came to present, she laid the cross-reference document on the table where the judge could see it clearly, and she walked through it the way her father had taught her to walk through an audit finding without drama, without embellishment, with only the facts and the sequence in which they occurred. Judge Arthur Whitmore was 61 years old and had presided over federal cases in Colorado for 19 years, and had the face of a man who had heard every variety of financial argument and was not easily impressed by any of them. He listened to Bellows' verbal agreement argument with no visible expression. He listened to Evelyn's cross-reference presentation with the same absence of expression. But when she finished, he asked 3 questions, and all 3 of them were directed at Bellows, and all 3 of them were variations on the same question: if the verbal agreement was real, why was the decision documented in writing between Grayson and his attorney weeks before it was supposedly communicated? Bellows answered each time. His answers were technically coherent and practically meaningless, and everyone in the room understood that, including Bellows. Caleb sat directly behind Evelyn, and she could feel his stillness, the deliberate, disciplined stillness of a man who had waited a long time for this room, and was not going to waste a second of it on visible emotion. Behind Caleb sat Harlan and Jim Aldridge and the Devereaux brothers, and Tom Cassidy, who had come with Clara beside him, her hand through his arm, her jaw set with the particular resolution of a woman who had made a decision and intended to see it through to the end. And behind all of them in the last row sat Walt Pruitt in the clean shirt he wore to church and funerals, with his white mustache trimmed for the occasion, watching the proceedings with eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Bellows called one witness, an accountant from Denver named Morrison, who testified that Grayson's interest rate calculations were consistent with market fluctuations during the relevant period. Evelyn requested the opportunity to ask 3 questions. Judge Whitmore granted it. She stood up. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "in your professional opinion, is an undisclosed rate adjustment applied retroactively to an existing fixed-rate contract consistent with standard lending practice?" Morrison shifted in his seat. "That would depend on the terms of the original agreement." "The original agreement specified a fixed rate," Evelyn said. "I've submitted it as Exhibit A. Does a fixed-rate agreement permit undisclosed retroactive rate adjustment?" "Not typically." "Second question," she said. "You testified that the rate applied to these accounts was consistent with market fluctuations. Can you show me the market index to which Mr. Grayson's adjustments were pegged?" Morrison looked at Bellows. "I would need to review additional documentation." "I have reviewed it," Evelyn said. "There is no market index reference in any of Grayson's internal documents. The rate was not adjusted to reflect a market. It was set by Mr. Grayson and applied uniformly across 12 accounts simultaneously, with no individual assessment and no contractual basis." She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "Third question. Are you familiar with Henderson & Carr, the accounting firm Mr. Grayson employed to verify his clients' records?" Morrison was very still. "I know of them." "Are you aware that Mr. Morrison of Henderson & Carr, your first name is Robert, is that correct?" "It is," Morrison said carefully. "Robert Morrison of Henderson & Carr appears in Mr. Grayson's internal correspondence as a preferred verification contact," Evelyn said, "retained to confirm to concerned borrowers that their accounts were accurate." She looked at him directly. "Are you that Robert Morrison?" The courtroom was very quiet. Morrison said nothing for 3 full seconds, which was in a federal courtroom an answer. Bellows was on his feet. "Objection! This is outside the scope." "It is directly within the scope," Evelyn said, still looking at Morrison. "Because if the witness was retained by Mr. Grayson to provide verification services to borrowers, while simultaneously serving as Mr. Grayson's expert witness in a fraud proceeding, that is a material conflict of interest that the court should be aware of," Judge Whitmore said. "Mr. Morrison, are you the Robert Morrison referenced in the plaintiff's Exhibit G correspondence?" Morrison looked at his hands. "Yes," he said quietly. The room's atmosphere changed like a pressure shift before a storm. Bellows requested a recess. Whitmore granted 15 minutes. During those 15 minutes, Caleb leaned forward from his chair behind Evelyn and said very low, "You knew." "I suspected," she said. "When I saw the name in Grayson's correspondence, and then saw the same name on Bellows's witness list." She paused. "I didn't know until he confirmed it." "You took a risk," Caleb said. "A calculated one," she said, "based on the evidence." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're extraordinary, Evelyn." She turned to look at him. It was the first time in 23 days that he had said something purely personal to her in a room full of other people without any covering of practicality around it. She held his gaze for a moment. "We're not done yet," she said. But she said it without looking away immediately, and that for Evelyn, Mercer Boone was its own kind of answer. The recess lasted 40 minutes, not 15. When Bellows came back, he requested a private conference with the judge and the federal deputies. That conference lasted another 30 minutes. When Judge Whitmore returned to the bench, his expression had not changed because it never changed, but something in the room had shifted irrevocably, and everyone felt it. Whitmore looked at Bellows. "Does your client wish to revise his position regarding cooperation with the federal investigation?" Bellows said, "My client is prepared to consent to a full audit of all lending accounts related to Red Hollow Valley properties and to cooperate with the Marshal's office regarding the bank's prior knowledge of irregularities." He said it the way a man says something he was told to say precisely and without inflection, because inflection would have required him to have feelings about it, and he had decided against that. Whitmore looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Boone, the court will schedule a formal restitution hearing for the affected parties. You'll be notified of the date within 30 days. Is the documentation you've submitted complete and available for court review?" "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "Including the duplicate set held by the Marshal's office." Whitmore nodded. He looked around the courtroom one more time at the ranchers in the gallery at Grayson, sitting rigidly beside his lawyers, at the federal deputies at Evelyn. "I've been on this bench 19 years, he said, and his voice carried the dry precision of a man who chose every word and wasted none. "I have not frequently seen evidence of this quality presented by someone who is not a member of the bar." He paused. "The court recognizes the work." He stood. The bailiff called the room to its feet, and in the back row, Walt Pruitt's white mustache moved in the specific way it moved when he was doing something he refused to call smiling. The twist that Evelyn had not anticipated came 6 days after the hearing in a letter from Marshal Haynes's office addressed to her specifically, not to Caleb, not to the Boone Ranch, to Evelyn Boone directly. The Marshal's investigation into Grayson's bank had uncovered in the course of the asset review, triggered by the freeze order, that the bank's internal file on the Grayson lending irregularities, the file connected to Edgar Pratt's 1876 review, contained not one letter, but 11. 11 letters spanning 4 years, in which Pratt had escalated his concerns about Grayson's account structures to 3 successive bank presidents, each of whom had declined to act. All 3 bank presidents were still in positions of influence in Colorado financial institutions. Marshal Haynes wrote that the investigation was expanding. He wrote that Evelyn's documentation had provided the framework that made the bank investigation possible, because without the detailed cross-referenced account analysis, the bank letters would have had no clear body of fraud to connect them to. He wrote that he expected the proceeding to involve federal banking oversight at a level not previously seen in Colorado territory. And then he wrote a sentence that Evelyn read 4 times before setting the letter down. The Marshal's office would benefit considerably from the continued analytical assistance of someone with your demonstrated competence in forensic accounting. If you have any interest in consulting on an ongoing basis, please write to this office at your earliest convenience. She set the letter on the table in the study, the same table where she had spent the first 4 nights of her life in Red Hollow, pulling Grayson's empire apart, and she sat with it for a long time. Caleb found her there an hour later. He read the letter. He read it twice, and then he set it down and looked at her, and his expression had all the complexity that a man's expression has when he is genuinely proud of someone and genuinely uncertain what that means for him in the same moment. "You're going to say yes," he said. "I don't know," she said. "Evelyn." "I don't know," she said again, but more slowly. "It would mean travel. It would mean time away from the ranch. It would mean—" She stopped. "We've been married for 23 days. We have not discussed what the next year looks like." "No," he said. "We haven't." "I'm not asking your permission," she said. She said it clearly but not defensively, as a statement of fact the way she stated all facts. "I'm saying we should discuss it." Caleb pulled out a chair and sat across from her. He put his arms on the table and he looked at her steadily. "The ranch is going to recover," he said. "The restitution hearing will return what Grayson took. I've got 6 good men and 30 years of my family's work in this land." He paused. "I don't need you to run the operation, Evelyn. I need you to want to be here." He paused again, and something in his voice shifted into the lower register that it went to when he was saying the thing under the thing. "Do you want to be here?" The question hung between them. Evelyn looked at the study around her. The stacks of papers mostly organized, now the evidence assembled and documented and submitted and copied. The lamp she'd kept burning past midnight for 10 consecutive nights. The desk where Caleb's father's ledger had sat when she first opened it, and she had seen the truth of what had been done to a good man's life in the columns of numbers he'd kept faithfully for 14 years. She thought about Philadelphia, about the narrow apartment and the accounting office, and the advertisement she'd answered with a pencil, and a sense that her capabilities were being wasted somewhere they weren't needed. "Yes," she said. "I want to be here." Caleb held her gaze. "Then write to Haynes," he said. "Tell him yes. We'll work out the travel as it comes." A pause. "This valley is going to need someone who can read numbers honestly for years. Grayson wasn't the only one. He was the biggest one." Evelyn said, "That's true. And you're the only person I've ever seen who can do it and also terrify a federal witness into confessing in open court without raising her voice." She looked at him. "I didn't terrify him," she said. "Evelyn," Caleb said. "You terrified everyone in that room." She considered that for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and began composing the letter to Marshal Haynes. The restitution hearing was held on January 14, 1883, 2 months after Evelyn's arrival in Red Hollow. What the hearing produced was not a dramatic courtroom confrontation that had already happened in December. What it produced was something slower and more durable, a federal order requiring Grayson's accounts, now fully audited under Marshall's supervision, to repay to each affected rancher the precise dollar amount that had been collected above the legally contracted terms, with simple interest calculated from the date of each overpayment. Evelyn had prepared the restitution calculations herself. Every number was documented. Every figure corresponded to a specific transaction on a specific date in a specific ledger. The court adopted her calculations without modification because there was nothing to modify. They were exact. Jim Aldridge received a figure that allowed him to pay off the remainder of his legitimate note outright. The Devereaux brothers received enough to formally challenge the Eastfield settlement, which a separate proceeding initiated by their attorney, a young man from Durango named Garrett, who had read about the case and contacted them directly, would eventually resolve in their favor. They got the Eastfield back in March. Tom Cassidy's restitution allowed him to winterize his barn and buy 3 additional head of cattle, which Clara had been asking for since before the spring Grayson's men had appeared at their door. Harlan Pruitt sat in the courthouse hallway after the hearing and read the restitution figure 3 times. Then he folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket and said to no one in particular, "Daddy would have liked to know about this." Walt was standing beside him. He said nothing. He put his hand on Harlan's shoulder and left it there. Martin Cole's case was the most complex and took the longest. The sale of his property had involved multiple parties and a chain of title that Grayson's attorneys had deliberately tangled to make unwinding difficult. But the federal investigation had flagged the sale in the initial freeze order, and by February, a settlement had been reached that returned Cole a sum sufficient to start again, if not on his original land, then close enough to it that it didn't feel like defeat. And Roy Fenner, the county clerk, cooperated fully with federal investigators and provided testimony regarding the filings he had processed at Grayson's direction over 4 years. His own debt to Grayson was discharged as part of the investigation's resolution. He did not thank Evelyn for this. But one morning in late January, he was at Millard's store when she came in for supplies, and he held the door open for her and said without looking directly at her, "Good morning, Mrs. Boone," in a tone that carried beneath its plainness the weight of a man trying to say something he didn't have words for. "Good morning, Mr. Fenner," she said, and walked in. Victor Grayson's cooperation with federal investigators, combined with the bank's decision to settle rather than litigate, resulted in a proceeding that did not end in a dramatic public trial. It ended instead in the way that well-documented fraud cases often end, when the documentation is irrefutable, with a consent agreement, a substantial financial penalty, the dissolution of his Colorado lending operations, and a prohibition on engaging in lending activities in the territory. It was not a prison sentence. Evelyn knew that would bother some people, and she understood why. When Harlan brought it up quietly, without anger, just the flat statement that a man who had ruined dozens of families for 15 years wasn't going to jail, she thought about her answer for a moment before giving it. "He's finished," she said. "His money is gone, not all of it, but enough. His operations are dissolved. His name is on a federal record that follows him wherever he goes. Every banker, every attorney, every business partner he approaches for the rest of his life will be able to learn exactly what he did here." She paused. "Is it enough? No. Is it what was achievable with the evidence and the law as they exist? Yes." Another pause. "So we make it enough. And then we make sure the next Grayson is stopped before 15 years. Harlan thought about that for a while. "Is that what you're consulting with the marshal's offices for?" he said. "Partly," she said. "Yes." He nodded. "Then I'm not going to argue with it." By February, the ranch was running at its full capacity for the first time in years. Caleb had used the partial restitution funds, the Boone account's overpayments, going back to 1879 to repair the south barn roof, which had needed it since the previous winter, and to pay Walt and Danny and the other hands the back wages he'd owed them for 2 seasons. He paid them in full in cash at the kitchen table one by one without ceremony, and each of them took their pay and said something brief and returned to work because that was the kind of men they were. Walt took his pay and said, "Took long enough." "Yes," Caleb said. "It did. I'm sorry." Walt said, "Buy me a better coffee pot. That one's been terrible for 3 years." Caleb bought him a better coffee pot. The ranch hands had watched the transformation of the past 2 months with the particular attention of men whose livelihoods depended on understanding whether a situation was genuinely improving or merely appearing to. They were not easy to impress. They had seen hard seasons, and worse ones had stayed through both, and they understood that a ledger correction in Denver did not automatically fix a fence or birth a healthy calf or keep the winter from arriving hard. But they watched Evelyn, and what they saw in her changed something in the way they understood the situation. Danny Croft was the most direct about it, because Danny was always the most direct. He came to Evelyn in the 3rd week of January and said, "I want to learn what you did. The accounting. The way you read those numbers." Evelyn looked at him. "Why? Because nobody in this valley should ever be in the position those men were in again," he said. "Not knowing what their own papers say, not being able to read the thing that's killing them." He paused. "I finished school. I can do arithmetic. I want to learn the rest." Evelyn said, "That will take time." "I've got time," Danny said. "I'm not going anywhere." She started teaching him the following Monday. 2 hours in the evening, 3 nights a week at the study table. She taught him the structure of a lending agreement, the difference between a fixed and adjustable rate, the signs of a fabricated amendment, the method for cross-referencing multiple accounts to identify systemic fraud. She taught him the way her father had taught her, not by explaining and waiting, but by putting a ledger in front of him and asking him what he saw, and making him articulate the answer, and then showing him what he'd missed. By March, he was finding discrepancies she pointed him toward. By April, he was finding ones she hadn't mentioned. "You're good at this," she told him one evening. He looked pleased, and then immediately tried to look like he wasn't. "I just pay attention," he said. "That's what good at this means," she said. The night before Evelyn left for her first consulting trip to Denver, Marshal Haynes had identified 3 additional cases in adjoining counties that bore the structural marks of Grayson's methods, possibly operated by associates. Caleb found her in the study, finishing her preparation notes. He leaned in the doorway the way he'd taken to leaning in doorways when he was watching her work, and didn't want to interrupt, but also didn't want to leave. She had learned to read that posture. She looked up. "You packed," he said. "An hour ago," she said. He came in and sat in the chair across the desk. The lamp was between them, as it had been on so many evenings, and the study was quiet. "3 weeks," he said. "Possibly 4, she said. "If the third case is as complex as Haynes's summary suggests." "I know," he said. He wasn't complaining. She understood that he